I've worked as a nurse aide in a small family-run nursing home for 6 years. It was an orphanage before it became a nursing home, and unfortunately before being shut down the orphanage had a history of severe abuse and neglect. Unfortunately, it's not gossip, the owner herself has told us. When residents get close to death, they always see a little girl. One of my patients was a very alert gentleman. He knew all our names and was very alert and oriented. I was passing dinner trays and saw that he had his back turned and was talking and laughing in the corner. I knocked and asked him who he was talking to, and he chuckled and said, "This little girl came into my room. She was scared." He died 3 days later. About 6 months later, had another patient screaming about a little girl grabbing his feet and she needed to leave him alone. He died that night. She's come up over the years. It's always the same thing. They see her and then they die. Other coworkers have had the same experience. It's very unsettling. I'm a psychiatric nurse. Early in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. There was a resident I'll call Marion Duchesne. He was an elective mute, which simply means that he couldn't talk, but there were no pathological findings as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life and seemed quite normal back then, with the notable exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the Deep South and joined the military when he was 19. After boot camp, he was stationed somewhere in the South. One night, he just vanished. He was declared AWOL for years, and finally, he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a VA hospital emergency room in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion Duchesne and I've been dead for 10 years. Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered with dust and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His social security number had not been used and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him, I guess via fingerprints. He was well-fed and in good health, except for his refusal to speak. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man and that whoever was claiming to be him simply could not be. They said he was a haint and a stand-in for their dead relative and demanded not to be contacted again. Marion paced all day, every day. Not in a frantic way, but just lumbering up and down the halls and outside. He smiled all the time and would be moving his mouth in a way that indicated talking or muttering, but he was dead silent. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open as if he were laughing heartily, but not even a breath could be heard. If told to go to the dining room for a meal, he'd go and eat. But if nobody told him, he just kept pacing, never indicating hunger. If offered a cigarette, he'd smoke it in an oddly formal way, almost delicately, if that makes sense. But he never seemed to crave smoking. The man wanted nothing. If I talked to him, he appeared to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. There was nothing to do for this man. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing because Marion would just grin, and unless told to stay put, he'd get up and start pacing again. On my last day at that job, on my way to something better, the last thing I saw was Marion, pacing in the parking lot, throwing his head back to laugh. Later, I wondered if all along I'd been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. I worked in a pediatric hospital and had always heard that the 4th floor right outside our oncology unit was haunted. I worked 3 to 12s normally, but would pick up overtime and picked up a night shift. I was working in the NICU, which happened to also be on the 4th floor, but on the opposite side. The oncology unit had a staircase that was a shortcut down to the cafeteria, which was on the 2nd floor. At about 3 a.m. I was ready to take a short break and wanted a cup of coffee from the cafeteria, so I decided to take that staircase. I walked through the automatic double doors and saw a kid skipping down the hall. I called out to him as I was afraid a little kid had snuck out of a patient room. As soon as I called out to him, he turned and in the blink of an eye vanished. A lot of other nurses and docs had seen the same little kid skipping in that same hallway. Of course, I chalked it up to exhaustion and didn't think about it much after that. But you are damn sure I didn't use that hallway at night ever again. I worked in geriatrics, nursing homes, for years, so most of our patients died within a few years of being with us. Anyway, I had a new patient move into one of the rooms in my hall that my previous patient had just passed in. My new patient kept calling at night saying that there was this woman who kept coming into her room and trying to talk to her. At first, I just passed it off on her being in her 90s and struggling with dementia, so I assured her that I would lock her door at night to make sure no one could come in. After about a week of this continuing to happen, I sat down with her and asked what this woman looked like, thinking she may just be hallucinating her daughter or sister or something, and she proceeded to tell me that this woman had a pink robe on with blue fuzzy slippers and her hair up in curlers, and the women would come and sit at the foot of her bed, pat the new patient's feet and try to talk to her, but she couldn't understand what she was saying. I almost pissed myself. The patient that I had had in that room prior to my new one went to bed every night in her pink house robe, blue slippers, and her hair in curlers. It stopped after about 2 weeks. Okay, I am a nurse, but this did not happen to me, but several other nurses who worked at these units. There is a little girl who haunts the burn unit of a large military medical treatment facility in the US. She has been seen by both staff and patients. Haunts may not be the correct term, but she has been witnessed by several. Second, I used to work at the old Walter Reed Army Medical Center. In the old one that moved back in 2011, there was a VIP ward, I believe it was Ward 72. Any retired general officers would stay there, along with any higher-ups in the government, think Secretary of State, and other cabinet officials. There was also a room for the First Lady and President. This ward is private, locked at all entrances, and very nice. It is furnished with very high-end furniture, and a lot of it was donated by Mrs. Mamie Eisenhower, the wife of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Well, per my friend who worked there, the ghost of Mamie Eisenhower is very particular about anyone staying in her room, and if anyone did sleep in that room, she would yank off the bed sheets. My friends also said decorative pieces would randomly fall off the table or fly off the walls when they were the only ones up there. Mamie would also apparently page the supervisor, who would call the ward back to a very confused nurse as to who paged them. Edit, I floated up there 2 to 3 times during my time there. My friend was on with me and told me all of this. I didn't believe her, so I went and sat in the room where Mamie would mess with people. I fell asleep, but sadly nothing happened that night. Sorry, I know you asked for nurses and doctors, but I couldn't help telling this one. Growing up, my maternal grandmother and I were always pretty sensitive to paranormal stuff, but my mother was not. She thought her mom was a crock, and she was sure I was making stuff up. Just as a preface. So while Mom was in nursing school, she worked as a home health aide. She got a pretty cushy gig working with this disabled woman named Mary. I was too young to know what was wrong with Mary, but looking back now, I would guess she was someone who was mentally fine though she was in her 50s. Mary's parents had provided well for her, left her with her giant, beautiful home fully equipped for a handicapped person, enough money in a fund to finance care, etc. So Mom was one of only 4 staff to work with Mary because she did not like new people, 2 midnighters and 2 day staff. She received around-the-clock care, but Mom was able to bring Mary home with her, so we spent a lot of time with Mary as a family. Mary was sweet and very kind. I have an old photo of me, her, and Mom when I was dressed for one of my dance parades. We all loved her to death. One morning, on a day Mom was off work but had school, she got up in a rush and ran downstairs. I thought she was late for school, so I went down with her to help her get what she needed to leave. But she was on the phone dialing people who were not answering her. I will never forget this. Mom was shaking and crying, blubbering to herself without making any real sense. She finally slammed the phone down on the table and put her hands on her face, and I asked her what was wrong. She told me she had woke up to Mary at her bedside, patting her hand the way she did when she was very pleased with something Mom did, but when she sat up in bed, Mary was gone. The phone rang, and it was the nurse at the house. Mary had passed away the night before. She came to tell Mom goodbye. She still never believed in the paranormal, but she did quit nursing school and never worked in home health again. She never said, but I got the sense she couldn't handle another Mary happening to her again. My mom was pretty stoic, but that broke her.